Chapter 13. Roads Less Traveled. Standing in the skeletal remains of the Border Patrol station, Shaw felt the gravity of the apocalypse pressing in on him from all sides. Emergency bulletins, now just white noise, still crackled sporadically from a battery-powered radio that had been protected inside a steel cage. Maps detailing sectors and routes hung on the walls like relics of a forgotten age. His colleagues had already deserted, gone to protect their own families, or died defending a place that hadn't any more purpose. Duty had held Shaw fast, but even duty had its limits in a world gone mad. Torn between the oath he'd sworn to his country and the promise he'd made to his family, he felt like a man on the edge of a crumbling precipice. But the emptiness of the station, the silence that swallowed his hesitations, made his decision painfully clear. With a heavy sigh, he locked the forsaken place, its insignia a symbol of an order that no longer existed. As he stepped out, abandoning the only life he'd known, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was also leaving behind a part of himself. But there was no time to grieve. Pennsylvania was a long journey away in a world now filled with dangers unimaginable. With one of only a few working vehicles due to the year and where it was located during the EMP, Shaw shifted his weight uncomfortably in the seat, his eyes narrowed at the sun setting in the distance. The empty highway was a mere shadow of its former self, now only scattered with the burnt-out husks of cars and the occasional remnants of lives interrupted. In this post-apocalyptic nightmare, one had a desire to remain low-key, a task made difficult when driving a candy apple 1969 Camaro Z28. He thought about Tucson and the hell he'd narrowly escaped, his mind drifting to the day when the EMP hit and fried everything. Communications, vehicles, order, all gone in an instant. Since then, his mission was simple but far from easy. Get back to his family in Pennsylvania. Being a Border Patrol agent had given him some survival skills, but little had prepared him for the bandits. Emotionally drained, Shaw drove cautiously on the debris-laden highways, his eyes scanning for any signs of life or danger. Then he saw her, a woman seemingly in distress, standing next to a rundown car on the side of the road. His instincts kicked in. He couldn't ignore someone in need. But as he pulled over and approached her, he sensed something was off. Before he could react, men emerged from the bushes, weapons drawn. "Oh, hold on. What do we have here? Nice car," the leader sneered, wrenching the keys from Shaw's hand. Cornered and outnumbered, Shaw had little choice but to let them take his vehicle. But his training hadn't left him entirely vulnerable. As they drove away, he noted landmarks and memorized features, storing away information that might later prove vital. Standing alone on the apocalyptic road, he felt the sharp sting of betrayal. It was a brutal lesson in the new lawlessness, a vivid reminder that the world he once knew had irrevocably changed. Stripped of his car but not his resolve, Shaw continued his journey on foot, hardened by the experience, but still propelled by the same urgent need to get back to his family. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with untold dangers, but he'd faced them all. Pennsylvania, and the hope of finding his family there, kept calling him home. They had taken everything, leaving him to limp away with just a pocket knife and the clothes on his back. From that point on, he decided to walk, avoiding the main roads as much as possible. The road east to Oklahoma City was a grueling testament to human endurance. Shaw found himself in an unforgiving landscape, battling scorching temperatures during the day and bitter cold at night. The soles of his boots wore thin, each step sending jolts of pain up his legs. He rationed his meager supplies, a few tins of beans, some water purification tablets, and a half-empty bottle of sunscreen. With every passing mile, he realized how perilous his situation was. It wasn't just the elements he had to contend with, but also the unsettling absence of law and order. Shaw encountered troubling signs of chaos along the way. Overturned cars stripped for parts, graffiti-laden billboards announcing the territories of different gangs, and even the occasional makeshift graveyard. Multiple times he hid from roving bands of looters, taking cover in the brush or derelict buildings, his heart pounding as he peered out at the hostile faces and weapons that passed by. His trusty sidearm had been reduced to nothing more than a baseball bat, even that he prayed he wouldn't have to use it. Hunger gnawed at him as his food ran out. He foraged for berries and edible plants, thankful for the survival training he had received in his earlier years as a Border Patrol agent. Yet each night, he went to sleep with his stomach aching and his muscles cramping from malnutrition and exhaustion. He wondered about his family. If he was struggling this much, what were they going through? Loneliness began to creep into his thoughts as days and weeks dragged on. He tried to maintain a semblance of routine, talking to himself to keep his spirits up, but the solitude wore on him. In the nights, he would pull out an old family photo, letting memories flood back as he looked at the smiling faces of his wife and children, pushing him to keep going despite the odds. By the time he reached the outskirts of Oklahoma City, Shaw was a shell of his former self, bearded, sunburned, and gaunt, but unbroken. As he entered the city, he could see that it had become a hub of anarchy, controlled by local warlords and filled with desperate souls. Little did he know that his hardships were far from over, that he would be captured and forced to labor in unimaginable conditions. But for now, as he took his first steps into the city, he felt a twisted sense of accomplishment. Despite everything, he had survived thus far, and he would continue to survive, whatever it took, to get back to his family. Oklahoma City had looked like a hellhole on the surface, but it was much worse once in the clutches of the man they called King George, a local warlord who ruled by fear with a city full of subordinates. The city had become one of the most difficult struggles of his life, once captured by King George's subordinates, and who put him to work in the worst way imaginable, cleaning out human waste from building bathrooms. Shaw shuddered at the memory. Escape had been risky, but staying was nothing but a slower kind of death. Like most warlords, King George began to think himself invincible, till the next want-to-be warlord put a bullet in him. Within the chaos of the new takeover, Shaw slipped away, gathering supplies and new boots on his way out of the city. Walking through the rolling hills of Missouri with caution, Shaw felt a sudden, unexpected crackle in his radio. It took a moment for him to realize what it was. A voice, distant but discernible, cutting through the static. The speaker talked about Ivory, resistance, and a group named the UCM. His pulse quickened as he fumbled with the dials on the solar-powered radio he'd found discarded along his journey, finally managing to tune in clearly. For the first time in weeks, the heavy curtain of despair lifted ever so slightly. Here was evidence that he wasn't alone, that there were organized groups fighting to restore order, to reclaim the America he'd once known. He listened intently as the voice, female, confident, outlined plans and coordinates. Ivory, she called herself, a beacon of resistance against the chaos that had engulfed the nation. Though he was set on getting back to his family in Pennsylvania, the broadcast presented a compelling case. The speaker talked about the urgency of collective action, the need for everyone to play a part in this crucial moment of history. As Shaw weighed the gravity of the message against the pull of his own personal mission, he was torn. But he knew, deep down, that the only way to ensure his family's future safety was to confront the terrors of the present. The next day, as Shaw knew he had to be nearing the Mississippi River, he clutched the solar-powered radio to his side like a lifeline. Gauging time was a rough art now, determined by the angle of the sun's shadows on the earth, and he found himself growing anxious. He'd been listening to static for about an hour, straining his ears for the momentary crackle that would signal the start of Ivory's broadcast. An hour had passed since he estimated it was about time for Ivory's broadcast, and still, only static greeted him. Just when he was beginning to think that perhaps he had miscalculated, or worse, that something had happened to the broadcast, his radio burst into life. Beyond your magnetically fried screen, she battles unknown horrors to provide you with current events and life-saving tips. Here's Ivory. Shaw stopped in his tracks, a smile breaking across his face as relief washed over him. He found a log to sit on and focused intently on the radio, eager to soak in every word. Listening to Ivory, Shaw felt less isolated, knowing that resourceful, strong people were fighting a good fight. Though the broadcast was short, it provided a rejuvenation of his soul to carry on. Deep down, he hoped her words would create this coalition, to provide structure and strength to resist the invaders and reclaim their land. And it strengthened his resolve to continue, to find a way to communicate with this resistance and give them the information he had obtained while captive in Oklahoma City, information that many were not aware of, nor heard Ivory speak in regards. The broadcast came to an end, but not before Ivory assured her listeners that she would return the next day, either at 9 a.m. or 3 p.m., to offer more updates and tales of resilience. The past 15 minutes, hearing Ivory's soothing voice, had a calming effect on Shaw that he hadn't experienced in months. It momentarily lifted the heavy burden of his arduous journey and the stark realities of the new world they were all navigating. Feeling an unexpected peace, he found a rotten log that seemed as good a place as any to rest. He curled up beside it, his radio silent but still clutched in his hand like a talisman of hope. As he closed his eyes, Ivory's words echoed in his mind, reinforcing the idea that hope was not lost, that there were still beacons of light in the darkness. And with that comforting thought, he allowed himself to drift into a deep, restorative sleep, undisturbed until the rays of the next morning's sun gently woke him. Feeling better than he had since embarking on his quest to reunite with his wife Michelle and their sons, Shaw set his sights on possibly crossing the Mississippi River by day's end. As he moved through the forest and up a significant hill, he unexpectedly came upon a group of people camped near the ridge. Torn between the need for caution and the urgency to move on, Shaw wrestled with his options. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, but he was also keenly aware that it was nearing 9 a.m., the time when Ivory would be broadcasting. The anticipation of hearing her voice again had an almost addictive quality. It made him feel like a drug addict with the next fix just within reach. Choosing to prioritize his safety while still hoping to catch the broadcast, Shaw decided to give the camp a wide berth, moving as quietly as possible while quickening his pace. He was pulled forward not just by the promise of progress on his journey, but also by the magnetic pull of Ivory's upcoming message, a message that had already proven its power to uplift his spirits in this grim, uncertain world. Ignoring his better judgment, Shaw started to hastily make his way along the hillside, hoping to circumvent the camp. But midway through his impromptu detour, he was suddenly intercepted and detained by men in military uniforms. "Listen, I'm a Border Patrol agent," Shaw pleaded in a voice raspy from dehydration and fatigue. "I'm just trying to get back to my family. Please, let me go." His captors remained silent, their faces impassive. Despite the good night's sleep he'd had, Shaw was far too weakened from his arduous journey on foot to put up much resistance. They restrained him tightly, their eyes showing no hint of mercy or understanding. Deep inside, Shaw knew that if he was to continue on his desperate quest to reunite with his loved ones, he would need to find a way out of this perilous situation, and fast. The soldiers led Shaw into the camp, straight to a towering, rough-looking biker who stood beside what appeared to be a heavily modified UN bus. As Shaw looked around, taking in the assortment of mismatched individuals and makeshift armaments, a sinking feeling of regret overwhelmed him. He knew he had made a grave mistake by not heeding his instincts and taking a more cautious route around the camp. Just then, as if guided by some divine intervention, Shaw's ears perked up. Faintly, coming from a radio inside the modified bus, he could hear a voice that immediately stirred his hope. Ivory's voice. "Wait, hold on!" Shaw blurted out, a sudden sense of urgency in his raspy voice. "Is that Ivory Hecker you're listening to?" The biker, whose stern face had been unyielding until that moment, raised an eyebrow. It was the first hint of a response Shaw had gotten since his capture, and he clung to it as a drowning man would to a lifeline. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was the opening he needed to find his way back to the perilous path that led home. Tank's gaze followed Shaw as he walked over to the makeshift sitting area beside the bus. One of the soldiers handed him an MRE, meal, ready to eat, and gestured to an empty chair. Shaw gratefully accepted the package, the weight of the foil-wrapped sustenance a tactile reminder of a generosity he hadn't felt in months. His hands trembled slightly as he began to open the bag, but then he heard it. Ivory's voice, only it was clearer, less distant than he had ever heard it before on his handheld radio. It was a disorienting moment, and Shaw looked up from his half-opened MRE to scan the faces around him. There, seated inside the bus and speaking into a microphone, was Ivory Hecker herself. The immediate rush of disbelief was so overpowering that he nearly dropped the MRE from his lap. From a sense of urgency, Shaw's voice cut through the air, abruptly pulling attention away from Ivory Hecker's broadcast. Even she briefly paused, turning her gaze towards him with a look of intrigued curiosity. Tank stood up and walked over, his eyes narrowing but also curious. "Whoa there, hold on! What's so important that it can't wait?" Tank demanded, the authoritative timbre of his voice betraying more than a hint of concern. Shaw took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Ivory's, and then Tank's. "You need to let everyone know. Thousands of armed civilians are forming a convoy. They're on their way to Jefferson City, Missouri, to join the UCM, to join the fight. I learned about it when I was held captive in Oklahoma City." Ivory's eyes widened with hope and caution in her gaze. She turned off the microphone, signaling a pause in the broadcast. "Are you certain of this?" she asked, the weight of the question resonating in the small space around them. "As certain as I can be," Shaw replied. "I met a man in Oklahoma City who translated a broadcast for me. The Chinese have invaded key areas in the United States following the EMP attack and destroyed most military bases. These people are rallying to fight back, and they need to know that there's a centralized force coordinating the resistance. That you're here." The gravity of Shaw's words settled over everyone present. Tank exchanged a glance with Ivory, who then nodded. Ivory's face tightened, her eyes reflecting the gravity of Shaw's words. "If what you're saying is accurate, it's vital information that people need to hear." She sighed deeply, making a split-second decision. "We'll do everything we can to verify it, but in the meantime, we need to alert our listeners. They need to know what they're up against, where the front lines might be forming." While Ivory continued to speak, Shaw felt a renewed sense of purpose swell within him. He had faced trials he could never have imagined, being carjacked by bandits, the forced labor in Oklahoma City, the perilous journey on foot, and all while wrestling with the agony of not knowing the fate of his family. But now, in this makeshift camp on top of a hill in Missouri, he felt like he had made a tangible difference. It wasn't enough to erase the hardships he had endured, but it did bring him a step closer to the man he needed to be, both for himself and for his family.